because most of your games of Magic are sideboarded games. Really, if you go to game 3, 2 out of your 3 games of Magic against that opponent is sideboarded. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 5 now of Battle Chads. What is sideboarding? We're going to talk about sideboarding, how to sideboard, the nuances of sideboarding. So I'm your host, Josh, and I'm with my co-host, Luis.
Hello.
You may notice we've got a new face with us, or a new face for some of years. But Helena, a very good friend of mine, we first met in Manchester all those years ago. Helena,
we did.
How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show today. Looking forward to it.
It's really good to have you. Like, obviously, we've been friends for years now, I'd say.
Donkey's years. Yeah, it's been ages.
So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself for those who don't know you?
Yeah, so I've been playing Magic. I think actually technically I've got my first Magic cards in 1999, but I've been playing since the original Ravnica, probably. Been playing kind of competitively since Return to Ravnica. Took a bit of a breakout for the pandemic, but been super back into the scene now, playing all of the RCQs, qualified for Naples now, which is great. Big fan of Standard and Legacy, mostly are my 2 formats that I mostly want to play.
Yes.
And Limited, of course, as well. A big fan of Limited too. And I'm actually a political commentator, so if you want to follow me there, it's at nojusticemtg. I promise there's no Magic Gathering content on there for you if you want to go there. But yeah, I do still play some Magic on stream, I guess, but not very much.
We'll make sure your socials are plugged into the show notes in there so people can come check you out.
For sure. I'll make sure you guys have a nice surrounding of the socials and everything. People will know where to find you if they want to find you.
So, Helena, you're very much known to be like, you bring very off-meta decks, which is quite relevant to this sort of...
the most famous rogue deck builder in Mordor, as good old Josh likes to refer it to.
True. I mean, I've always wanted to turn up with something that I feel attacks the metagame rather than is part of the metagame, I guess, personally. Always wanted to try and see what I can do to be able to find what is the level 2 deck, I guess.
I'm going to talk about that sort of methodology and that sort of thinking further on, because it's one of those things that when someone sits down opposite you, it's like, oh, what is this deck and how do I sideboard against it?
True. I mean, the amount of free wins I've gotten from people just not understanding how cards work. Perfect. Love it.
So what is sideboarding? Luis, what is sideboarding?
To me, sideboarding is the most difficult skill in Magic to master. It is one of those things that seems so whatever, it's just sideboarding. You have 15 cards, just use it to answer whatever your opponent's doing, but it's so much deeper than that. So much more deeper than that. And it is a skill that I've yet to master. It's going to take a long time. I think even most pros haven't mastered that skill yet. It is such a difficult thing to encompass your full mental prowess into that hopefully you'll learn a lot from our discussion here today.
So the whole purpose of sideboarding is to essentially change or make amends to your game 1 strategy or game 1 deck to best position you against your opponent. Would you say that was fair?
Yeah, that's about right.
So along with that, you need to figure out, well, what your plan is, particularly your game 1 plan, or particularly going into games 2 and then game 3, and how you can change that or alter that. Identify what is good in your deck against that matchup and what isn't so good in that matchup, because it's very easy to bring sideboard cards in, but the real trick is what to take out.
Yeah, that's one of the mistakes many Magic players make. They dilute their decks too much, where their deck is not really functional to what it was trying to do, especially when it comes to the combo decks or the decks that are a little more... They necessitate a certain amount of cards of its combo to actually work. A lot of people take out too many things. They're like, oh yeah, well, this card's good against them, this card's good against them, without keeping in mind that their deck has to actually win the game as well, not just answer what the opponent's doing.
So there's different types of sideboarding we can categorize. It's mainly, well, the main types are bringing answers in from that sideboarding, but you can also have something called transformational sideboarding too. Helena, that's something you've ever delved in. I believe it's something you've probably delved in the past.
Absolutely. I do enjoy having a good transformational sideboard, especially when they don't know what you're doing in game one, which is a lot of my time approaching Magic. And then they definitely don't know what you do in game two if you then transform your sideboard. Because you remember, a lot of people will look at sideboarding and assume, well, what I'm trying to do is answer my opponent's game plan with what I'm bringing in, rather than how am I modifying my game plan to beat them. And that's one thing. Because it may not be a transformational sideboard, but you're thinking, instead of just bringing in answers, you also think about what threats are you bringing in that are better against their answers. And then, of course, we've got all of the other discussion that we can have about how you're also sideboarding, not just against a game one deck, but also against a game 2 and 3 deck.
Because most of your games of Magic are sideboarded games, really. If you go to game 3, 2 out of your 3 games of Magic against that opponent is sideboarded. And throughout those games too, Luis, we talked about this before the show, about how the more you give away in your game 2 can drastically change your game 3. I don't know if you want to go into that point that you maybe focused. I thought it was a really good point.
Yeah, it's one of the things that a lot of Magic players don't really pay attention to. They view their sideboard guides and they write down what comes in, what comes out against the matchup, but then they don't stop to think, okay, now in game 2 I've revealed that I have my Koth or my big planeswalker or a artifact that they didn't expect me to have because I wasn't running artifacts game 1. And now the opponent knows you have them, and they're going to bring in cards to actually defeat that. And now you can't rely on that game plan like you did in game 2. And people don't take that into account. They're like, oh yeah, just run it back, it'll be fine. And then they absolutely get destroyed by someone bringing in a specific card to defeat them, and their game plan doesn't work, and their deck isn't functioning anymore because of that. So many people miss this nuance of game 2, game 3, and it's a very important thing to pay attention to for any deck that you play. Not just combo decks, not just A, B, C plan decks, but for literally anything. Mono red.
I think the biggest, I think the biggest example that comes to mind of this very specific situation for me is when you're playing a control deck. Say if you're playing control against like a mid-range deck, for example. One of the things that mid-range deck is very likely to do in game 2 is take out their removal spells, because most control decks are going to be playing instants and sorceries and very few win conditions and things that are not going to be targets for, say, creature-based removal. But say, for example, look at the current standard format. A control deck might bring in Chrome Host Seed Shark, for example, which is a creature. When you cast spells, instants and sorceries, it creates incubator tokens. So it's creating a creature and more creatures. If they see it in game 2, they're going to bring in removal spells for it. It might not be the thing that is deciding for the matchup, but if you then get your opponent to understand in game 2 that they should be bringing removal spells back in, you can then bring out all of your creatures for game 3 so they still have blank cards in their deck.
Exactly. And that catches people with their pants down. It will give you a huge advantage when your opponent draws their whatever, go for the throats or little middling removal spells, and you have nothing that they can hit. That is completely dead cards. That's card advantage in a way that you didn't think about before. And it's definitely a big aspect of the game, which will help you level up and actually perform better at tournaments. It's one of the things that most people don't realize when playing the game. I've had too many people tell me, oh, how do you always have every card that you need and I keep drawing these blanks? Well, this is why. Because I'm changing what I'm doing to beat what I expect you to bring in against me. But now if your opponent is on par with you and doing the same thing, then it becomes a little bit more of who can get those small increment of advantages. And sideboarding is going to be one of the main things that does that for you game 2 and 3.
Because not only are you sideboarding for the deck or playing against the deck, you're playing against the person as well, particularly in paper. Like you can potentially, if they're not savvy enough, you can see how many cards they're bringing in by just them taking them out the deck box, put them there. Like, look at that, right? They're bringing 4 cards in. That's not very transformational. I don't think that's going to be a transformational sideboard. They're bringing 10 cards in. Oh, the deck is going to drastically change. I need to try and think on the hoof what that might be. And knowing the meta will help that. Knowing the meta will not only give you an idea of what sort of threats, sort of answers there are, but also focus your sideboard. Like, I love a meta where there's a best deck, because it's really easy to focus a sideboard, because if back in, say, look at 2018 when Is It Phoenix was the best deck in Modern, you had to pack Graveyard Hate, and if you weren't doing that, then you're just going to open yourself to failure. I mean, it's a double-edged sword with that, because you feel like you're forced to play these cards, but at the same time, your sideboard is focused, and with however many cards there are in whatever format you're in, every card you bring into your deck, you're not bringing in something else.
Yeah, it's one of those big things, during that time, I think it was 8 to 11 graveyards hate pieces, which was ridiculous. People hated it because it wasn't a very fun time either playing against those pieces or being able to defeat the other decks that didn't need a graveyard. But it was kind of a necessity, and it's one of those things to measure as a meta evolves, whether how many sideboard pieces should you really dedicate to what's going on. Or even, more recent times, modern, you had people running 3 to 4 Chalice of the Voids because Rhinos was the best deck, which was nice because it would also hit Living End. But then you realize that Chalice didn't do a whole lot against many, many other decks. So you have to diversify your kind of sideboard hate to still deal with Rhinos, but be able to defeat everything else going on. And jumping back a little bit to what you were saying about how many cards and showing your opponent the cards, there's a famous thing I remember that Reed Duke talked about, where he would grab his entire sideboard, all 15 cards, put it into his deck, and instead of picking it out and then putting them in, he would actually go through his deck and pick them out slowly, one by one, without revealing to his opponent how many cards he's actually bringing in and how many he's taking out, as that gave him a little bit of an edge in, maybe not as much as you'd expect, but still enough of an edge that it was relevant for him to do.
But if you look at, sorry, go on, Helena.
I was going to say also on the point you were saying before as well about the idea that if there's like a best deck, people are wanting to use their sideboards effectively to try and combat that best deck. And also the fact that people are doing those kinds of sideboarding will also change what decks you can bring to a format.
Yes.
So for example, you take that Arclight Phoenix metagame that you spoke of previously, people are packing loads of graveyard hate. Well, then you can't turn up with Dredge to this tournament because you know that everyone is going to be packing hate cards in their sideboard to play against a different deck that happens to have splash damage against you.
I remember when Faithless Looting got banned, because I was a Dredge player back then. It was quite egregious too. But when they banned Faithless Looting, I went to a tournament in Stockport, Element Games. I think it was a 30-player something tournament, modern. I think there was a standard RC run, or the equivalent of an RCQ back then at the time. So I ran modern, and I ran Dredge, and everyone thought, oh, Dredge is dead because of Looting's dead, but it wasn't. It just adapted. And no one had sideboard hate for Graveyard in the entire tournament, and I went like 7-1, winning the whole thing with Dredge. Because I saw that, it was one of those things that it's my pet deck anyway, but I thought, well, no one's going to bring sideboard. All the sideboard's going to be gone. And I remember playing against that Rory, and he was on Death Shadow at the time, and he was like, I was in I think it was the semi-finals against him, and he was like, I've got no sideboard cards against you. So I just did spam a wheel and just ended up winning.
Yep, everyone took out their Relic Progenitus, Rest in Peace, whatever other, Leyline of the Void. I think it was a 4 of in just about every deck at the time. Faithless Looting banned. Oh yeah, those cards aren't required anymore. And then suddenly graveyard decks are unanswered. It's one of those things that a lot of people don't pay attention to whenever bannings happen. Just because some cards got banned doesn't mean the entire strategy is void and null and void. And that's another thing we really want to talk about is how to keep a certain amount of cards in your sideboard for general utility. Because I think there is some importance to that. While it is good to target a metagame and defeat the metagame, general utility sideboard cards are still very important so you don't lose to random XYZ rogue deck that you weren't expecting. And that's one of those things that you have to measure how many of these slots should go to generic utility, how much should be metagame focused.
And on top of that, we'll need to understand the kind of breadth of cards that you would put in a sideboard to begin with, right? From kind of base principles. Obviously, we talk about graveyard hate. That's hating out a specific strategy. But you'll have some cards that you'll have that are just good against certain other types of cards or types of spells your opponents are likely to play, that have certain utility against different kinds of creatures, for example, and understanding based upon what you expect to see, especially if it's kind of conditional, the kind of cards that you would want to bring in and how many of each of those you want to have in your sideboard.
Yeah, so great points there. So it's all alluding to like, how do we actually sideboard? Like, how do we approach our game 2 and 3? And I think it's important to know that if you're like a game plan that relies on A/B sort of deck building, your deck relying on A strategy and B strategy to make equal win, then how are you going to dilute, or how are you going to change your AB to bring in potentially a C strategy, or how is their strategy? What is their game plan against you? And then you can then sideboard against that, because you got to remember, games 2 and 3, you can't sideboard, or you shouldn't sideboard against the main deck. You should be sideboarding for their sideboarded deck.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those kind of issues in sideboarding that a lot of people struggle to understand what exactly their opponent is going to do against them and how relevant it is. And it's being able to analyze that will let you pick out the exact tools you want to bring in. Because like we spoke a little bit earlier, it's not just about answering your opponent, it's also about not diluting your deck so much so you can still make your plan work, your strategy work. And how to sideboard and how to get down to that, a lot of it comes with experience. It is one of those things that you have to play hundreds of games of Magic, especially with your specific deck, to understand the different relations it's going to have against different opponents. But we can speak a little bit more about the general theory of how to do so with we'll start with an aggro deck. How should an aggro deck really sideboard? Now, in my experience from playing aggro and those style of decks, you don't really need to bring in too many cards in aggro decks. Your deck is fully functional in and of itself, and you're asking the questions. You're not looking for answers for the most part. Your sideboard, when you are bringing cards in, should never be this whole, I'm bringing in 10 cards, bringing in, that kind of massive amount. It's not what you're looking to do. You usually want to have 3 to 4, maybe 5 cards that answers the specific problem cards that your opponent has or is going to have in game 2 and 3. And that's what aggro is mainly looking to do. That's what I found.
I think also as well, it's interesting thinking about like how you sideboard with an aggro deck too, is it also shows into focus how you would construct the sideboard in the first place, depending on your deck archetype. So in an aggro deck, you say you're only bringing in 4 or 5 cards, absolutely correct. What's interesting as well is that when you're constructing the sideboard to begin with an aggro deck, you're only going to be seeing probably about 15 cards maximum off the top of your deck. So if you're going to be bringing in having a certain amount of cards that you have in your sideboard to bring in a certain matchup against a certain archetype to answer certain ways in which they might answer your game plan, you're going to have 3 or 4 of the same card or the same kind of card in your sideboard to ensure that you have the maximizing of, you're sure you are going to maximize seeing that card in the time frame of how long the game is going to last. Whereas you contrast that with, say, a control deck where you might actually just have 1s and 2s in your sideboard because you're going to be seeing 20, 30, possibly even 40 cards over the course of an entire game.
And it's
when
exactly
you look at formats like Legacy, who play Brainstorm, Ponders, all those cantrips, and you look at if you are a standard player, like a standard aggro player, you might have your 4 of removal, your 4 of this, your 3 of that, and then you contrast to a Legacy deck, you're like, oh, this seems like a really important hate piece, but there's only 1 of. But then you, as Helena rightly said, you need to look at how your deck is constructed. If your deck is constructed to where you're seeing a lot of cards, like if you're playing a Ponder Brainstorm, you're seeing 2x, 3 times the amount of cards you would in an aggro deck, you're going to have a higher chance of seeing those cards and seeing those cards when you need them as well.
And that's for, I'm sure some of the more experienced players that are listening will have had this conversation with a newer player where they're like, yeah, but I think this card is amazing and it's going to defeat this one matchup really well for me. And they're playing like mono red, mono white, something that doesn't draw cards. And you're like, well, it's great that card might do that, but what are the chances you're actually going to see it? Super low. So why are you running a fun of one of kind of card? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work for your game plan if you're actually looking to win games of Magic. And it's analyzing that and learning that skill for each format will help you a lot. Standard, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, they're very different in how they actually are structured. Standard tends to be the format where you see the least amount of cards because the card draw isn't as diverse for the most part. Obviously, there's some decks that view more cards than others, but it's those kind of things. That's why you see more 3s and 4s in standard sideboards than you do in modern or legacy sideboards, because you have so much more utility to actually find them with different cards in your deck that you don't when you're playing a lower amount of card format.
And if you're playing in like I also take account mana cost as well, because say if you've got low to the ground deck, or a deck where you might have a longer game plan. You bring in cards that are, say, 5 CMC or even potentially 6 CMC. You're not going to want to see that in the early game, but you will want to draw into that at some point. So you might go low to the ground on them in terms of how many you play, because you don't want to see 2 of them in your opening hand because it's basically a 5-card hand, or you when you do want to see it, it's going to be later on in the game. So you might trim on the amount of those sort of cards that you play. Board wipes is a good example. So you want to see that board wipe when they've sort of developed the board, so you get maximum use out of it. So you might be one of those things that you maybe only bring 2 of in because eventually you want to see it. You don't want to see it potentially in the early turns of the game before you've drew those cards.
Interesting thinking about mana costs as well, specifically within the context of an aggressive deck, is that one of the things that aggressive decks will do will be wanting to curve out. And so what you're also going to have to take account of when you're sideboarding, when you're creating your sideboard plan, is how is the cards I'm going to bring in, how are they going to affect what my mana curve looks like in game 2? And then also we're going to think about what's happening in game 3 when your curve might look different as well.
Yeah. I've definitely seen a lot of players where they go, oh, I'm gonna bring in my 3 mana haymakers, and they're taking out 1s and 2 drops. And you're like, wait, why are you doing that? If you're bringing in a 3 mana card, you should be looking to remove usually a 3 mana card in an aggressive deck, so the curve still fits, so it doesn't skew it too much and make your game plan not function. Or if you're gonna bring in 1 drops, you don't want to take out your bigger drops unless there's a reason for it. For example, if you're facing a deck that you just know you can't beat in the late game, where if they get to turn 5, 6, 7, you're not winning. Sometimes it's better to have those early lower drop cards and remove the higher end drops for that reason. I've seen many players remove their what are they called? The stuff like Godric and those like clunkier 3 mana cards, because they know that they're strong, but it's a 1 threat. And if I'm playing that on turn 3, my opponent is ready for it. They're keeping up the removal on that turn. So I'd rather have 2 or 3 small 1 mana, 2 mana creatures to play on turn 3 than 1 3 mana creature on turn 3. Those kind of things as well.
Yeah, it can also go into something like knowing how efficient your opponent's removal spells are. Whereas you think, well, Godric is individually a very powerful card, but if you were playing against an opponent who has a bunch of 1 mana removal spells in their deck, can you really afford to lose the tempo at spending your entire turn casting something that can get answered 1 for 1 at a tempo loss to yourself? Which can also change whether or not you're sideboarding based upon your opponent's removal suite. You can't just sit there, obviously we'll talk about sideboard plans later, but you can't just sit there saying, well, I've got this plan here to bring in all of this specific card against this control deck, when the suite of removal spells they might have could be completely different depending on whether it's blue, whether it's white, even within an archetype.
Exactly. Yeah, because if you're playing against a red removal based deck, and you're playing a big dirty creature, that's going to be, they're going to have to double spell to kill it, which you most of the times you're fine with, or there's just going to be out of the reach for their kill spells, and you probably want to bring them in. That's a better, more of a consideration than if you're against someone who's playing like black removal, which is solid. This creature is dead, so you might choose to sideboard differently depending on, as Helena quite rightly said, the color combinations of removal spells that you expect to see, and it's understanding as well the speed of the game that's going to happen when you come to sideboard. More relevant to this point when you're thinking, right, am I on the play or the draw? If I'm against an aggro deck and I'm on the draw, I need a really low to the ground sort of post-sideboard game where I might be taking things that are slower. For example, the card Counterspell is probably worse on the draw against a really fast aggro deck, but fine against, say, a combo deck where they need time to develop. So you might cut things that are really, really good cards that are just too slow on the draw. So it's knowing, how do you sideboard play versus draw?
Yeah. So a prime example is a deck like Murktide versus Hammer Time. A lot of the time, you need to take out Counterspell in that matchup when you're the Murktide player. While it seems, wait a second, I wanna hit their big going off turn because it's a combo deck and all this and that. Well, a lot of the time you can't hold up Counterspell because you need to hold up your Lightning Bolt or your Unholy Heat or whatever, and you can't hold both up when you're on the draw. So you have to take out Counterspell to make room for these 1 mana kind of removal spells and be able to play to the speed of your opponent while you're just trying to survive. That's how those matchups, play with each other. And this is over any format, you'll find that kind of shtick essentially, where you need to learn when a 2 or 3 mana card that is really good on the play is abysmal on the draw, and how and when to take it out.
Because you always have to play. When I play a game, I'm like, right, how do I play to win, not to play, not to lose? And if you're playing not to lose because you're on the back foot, they're eventually going to come over the top of you and take that game. It's just a matter of time and drawing the right answers and the cards. And if you can, what is my game plan? Identify my game plan, envision my game 2, and then thusly my game 3. And how am I winning that game? Not how am I not losing that game? Because you can bring in Rest in Peace against a graveyard strategy. That's you not losing that game. But how am I then going to win that game? How am I using how am I slowing that opponent down? How am I using the game speed to take the advantage? And that's a lot of the skill within that sort of tempo decks. Is I'm controlling the board, I'm presenting a threat, and then I'm going to eventually come over the top of that hill and win the game.
Because how many times as a Magic player have you played your Haymaker, sideboard card, your Rest in Peace, Leyline of the Void to absolutely stop your opponent's strategy, but then you dirtle and do nothing for the next 4 or 5 turns. They find their Nature's Claim or whatever, remove that piece, and then you lose anyway. It happens, I'm sure, a lot of the time.
Yeah, or potentially even the hate card you're bringing in doesn't just like flat out win the game. Like you say, obviously, like Leyline of the Void against Dredge, for example. But if you're bringing in a hate card that's like a graveyard-based removal against something that relies on the graveyard for some things but doesn't for other things, like, can you afford to take turn 2 or 3 off to play your hate card when your opponent's still applying pressure that you don't necessarily automatically win the game by windmill slamming this certain hate card?
Yeah, it was one of the things that happened a lot, for example, during the Rakdos scam reign. People would bring in Leyline of the Void when their game plan wasn't great already against Rakdos scam, thinking, oh yeah, Leyline, that will defeat their grief combo plan, and then they would just lose to the fair mid-range plan, play the Ragavan, the Fable, the Mirror Breaker, and then you'd be like, wait, but I had Leyline of the Void, how did I lose? Well, that's why, because you're not doing anything to actually function within the game. You're just looking to answer your opponent's combo or main thing, but that's not good enough. You have to be able to play the actual game, and your sideboard has to reflect that.
You have to be thinking, like, what does my game 2? How do I win my game 2? And how do they win? Because they know that I'm going to bring in. If you're a graveyard strategy mage, that you're expecting graveyard hate, so you're expecting something that, well, your opponent's going to expect these cards that I bring in. So what is my opponent thinking? How's my opponent envisioning their game around my hate? Like I said, like you alluded before, I slam a Rest in Peace, I slam a Leyline of the Void. Then you end up dying to Stinkweed Imps because you've diluted your deck so much that you're not actually winning the game. You're just stopping from losing from their strategy.
And then, what do you guys think then in terms of mid-range decks and how they sideboard? Because I think mid-range is probably one of the hardest ways to sideboard because they range so diversely. There's so many things you can do with a mid-range deck. Some of them are aggressive slanted, some are control slanted. How would you try and look at the game when you're on your, let's say something like Jund Sagavan, it's a mid-range deck, slightly more aggressively slanted. How would you look at the game from that perspective?
I think in general, it's all about knowing a game. First of all, every single different facet of sideboarding is going to come into how you're going to approach it. Like, what's your game plan? What's your opponent's game plan? How are they sideboarding? What are you sideboarding in against them? Because every single little edge that you can gain over your opponent and vice versa is going to have loads of different impacts down the line, because these games, especially in mid-range decks, they usually have the games going long. They usually have to try and find every little bit of value that they can gain here and there. That's usually what most mid-range strategies try and rely on. And not having your plan line up in the correct way by drawing too many answers or not enough or too many threats, and that not corresponding with the way your opponent is all playing their game, first of all, and also how they've sideboarded in, can lose your game immediately. So I think you say it's obviously the most very complex part of sideboarding Magic, and I would absolutely agree with that.
I think with mid-range, it's one of those things that, like, as a mid-range deck, your game, the way you play that game, because it tends to go further on in sort of the time, like you're playing that game for a longer period, there's going to be times in that game where, right, I am now on the defense. Okay, how do I get out the defense? I am not. I've done a game action. I've killed something, or I've swayed the game in a way. Right now, I am on the attack, and it's identifying what role you're playing at that specific time in the game. And if you can identify that role, identify that game plan, that is going to help you in the long run with that game. Even if it means, like, people draw a card, you've got 7 cards in your hand, you've got another 53 cards in that deck. What do you want to draw? I have an idea, like what I would like to see. Do you play cantrips? Like, what are you cantripping for? Like, you're playing your cards with purpose. You're identifying what role you are in that moment, and you want to know you're thinking in your opponent's turn. And when you enjoy your turn, if I draw this, I can do this. If I don't draw this, I still have this. If I never see this, what is my game plan? And it's that sort of nuance to a mid-range strategy that I find quite interesting, actually.
Yeah. How about mulliganing with sideboard cards? When do you decide to mulligan more aggressively? When do you decide to just take it and go, with a normal hand? How do you make those decisions in game?
I think it's a combination of a few things. What are you against? If you're against a fast combo deck, say if you were playing a format like, let's say like Legacy or Modern, and you know you could potentially die turn 3, turn 4, you need to mulligan fairly aggressively. Now, the London Mulligan is great for this because the London Mulligan lets you essentially sculpt a hand. You do put one back, but it's a great mulligan system. You need to understand the deck speed, I think. Understand your deck speed. And if you can slow them from there, say if you look at reanimate your sideboard. Against reanimate, I sideboard for turn 1, turn 2, and turn 5. Because I need to stop them from doing the really stupid free win stuff. And then I need to stop them from doing when they eventually draw and start hard casting the big nasty monsters. I need to have a game plan for that. So, for example, I guess I'm just using Legacy. It's a format I play the most, so I'm just going to use Legacy example. So against game 1 and 2, you might have your Force of Wills, your surgical extractions, that sort of stuff. But then later on, I also want my Brazen Borrowers, because if they stick a threat, I want to answer that threat. I also want a tempo threat in response. And it's sort of, do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think as well that when you talk about something like Brazen Borrower, because it is both an answer and a threat, it tells you the value, especially in a mid-range strategy, not just having main deck cards that have multiple uses, but having sideboard cards that have multiple uses as well. Being able to play with a card in your sideboard that can come in multiple different matchups that's good in different parts of the game, as well as just being something that we were discussing, cards that might be debilitated to an entire strategy, rather than something that has so many different aspects of utility that you might not be able to just put in your main deck.
The example of that is in Pioneer with Phoenix adopting Prismari command. I've seen that a few times where it's sort of been a really good jack of all trades, master of none sort of card, and we're going to see it with the new set when it comes out, Outlaws, with the spree cards.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I've adapted that card into my deck these days because everyone is ready for Phoenix. They have their Grafdigger's Cage, their whatever random lantern spell to remove the Phoenixes, and they get caught off guard. You do Prismari command on their end step because they weren't expecting it. You remove it, and then you go off. It's fantastic. It's one of those things that a lot of people miss when it comes to these like modal spells that helps prepare you for what the metagame is doing against you. And that that you can do that with both main deck building and sideboard building. What exactly you want to put into it and how much do you need it to do. Some cards are really specifically good, very focused. Some cards are better to have as answer a little bit of everything. And Prismari Command is a perfect example for that.
It's when you're picking to put cards in your sideboard, you need to have a reason for it. Say, for example, I see a weird and wonderful sideboard option, and they go, "What is that for?" And they're like, "I don't know. I saw it on a list online. It was, well, that card is as good. You may as well have a 14-card sideboard, because if you don't know why that's in your deck, you've just put yourself at a massive disadvantage by one card. And if you have a reason, for example, you're playing a card that no one's seen before, or a real new tech, like when Rhinos of Old started playing Dismember, like, well, what's that for? And then they explained why. Oh, of course.
Yep.
If you have a reason for that card, whether it be your own reason or it might be a reason that people have jumped on with or might even disagree with. If your reasoning is sound, or you have a reason to play that card, then you probably should play that card. And if you don't have a reason to have that card in your deck, why is it there?
Well, exactly. It means that if you're going to be having a card in your sideboard, you need to know how you are going to sideboard and what plan you have, which of course is something that you can write up beforehand and make notes throughout.
Yeah, it's quite acceptable to have a piece of paper in your deck box with a rough plan on how you're going to board against certain decks or certain decks you're expecting, and making sure that on that plan as well you have on the play, on the draw sort of highlighted on there. And one of the ways to sort of be successful in like particularly a paper tournament is the more prep you can do beforehand. And we've talked in the past about making sure you've got food, making sure you've got snacks, and making sure you're well rested, all that stuff. But if you're playing like a control deck and you're expecting to against other control decks, you're gonna have 50-minute games of Magic. And if you can save time in brain energy essentially by pulling out a piece of paper, going, yep, you've already done that work. That work's already done. You're not thinking on the hoof.
Yeah, and this is what we talked a little bit about before as well. That piece of paper is very good. It will help you a lot in getting the rough estimates of what's happening in the matchup out of the way. You still have to think about how you're changing for game 3 if it does come down to it. What pieces have you revealed to your opponent? What exactly are they going to change now because you revealed these pieces? And it's those players that are able to adapt using something that gives them information first that go the farthest. They're the ones who do the best. So that piece of paper helps you a lot in, like Josh was saying, save brain energy, save time, save a little bit of effort, but then learn to adapt with it. It doesn't mean you have to do exactly what's on this piece of paper. You have to know what to change because of XYZ. But having that little thing come first is definitely, it saved me many times in the past. It's something that helps me out a lot when I'm going to tournaments. I go to them way too often not to have. But I did learn to make my own sideboard guide, my own piece of paper. Because a lot of people just take whatever's online. They're like, oh yeah, this is good enough. And they stick by it. Which then they come to realize, wait a second, this card that's in this sideboard isn't in my sideboard. This card doesn't do what I thought it did. It doesn't work this way. And then they get wrecked. Because they're not doing the reps.
Well, you've got to think, if you've got access to that sideboard guide and you found it on Google or whatever, then someone else who wants to beat your deck has probably seen that guide and understands how someone's gonna sideboard. But it's all well and good like going to an FNM. I picked up a deck for the first time. I'll check someone who's been doing well with it. Although they've got a sideboard plan, yeah, I'll follow that. But if you want to win, say, an RC level event or something, or a bit more juicy than an RCQ or an FNM, you've got to be able to look at your sideboard guide, take into account what other people have said, how they sideboard, come up with your own sort of plan that works for you, but also adapt that plan. Like whatever says on that piece of paper, I am not bound by those decisions, but because you don't know what tech might someone can bring in. It's like, for example, like if I know against Helena, for example, my piece of paper, I may as well just not look at
it. I mean, what's interesting though is when you have these kind of this, not just a guide, but also just a general plan, it also helps you on how you build your sideboard, because it's not just what you put in, it's also what you take out as well. And understanding, going through those reps of saying, well, if I'm going to bring in this certain card, for example, part of my broader plan, my broader guide that I have is that this usually comes out when this comes in. So when you're constructing your sideboard, you don't have a bunch of things that you want to bring in. You have to start trimming bits and pieces there where you don't really know what you should or shouldn't be taking out. By having that guide laid out, you know fully, right, well, if I'm taking out this certain part of my deck, it has to get replaced by these certain cards in my sideboard, because that's what creates, I know what we were talking about previously, like how our curve pans out, how we don't dilute our strategy, and having that plan beforehand will help you not just construct the sideboard, but also on terms of when and where you can adapt later on as well.
Absolutely.
The most helpful things I use the guides for, if I do, is essentially what do I take out, because it's relatively easy to know what to bring in, especially play draw. It's kind of easy what you're bringing in, but taking out is the real nuance, especially if you're playing a combo deck that really relies on, 2 or 3 cards working together, but you also have to see those cards. And if you're dialing to the point where, oh, I've got my sideboard card, but now it's at the point in the game where it's irrelevant, I really wish this was my whatever spell to combo off, then it's knowing the right numbers and doing that work and doing that essentially math before you sat down under the pressure of your your opponent, you might be in a feature match area. Imagine if you're in a feature match area, you got that pressure as well. Or you got people watching you. If like I said, alluded before, if you control deck, you might have an audience gathered around you. How you deal with that pressure and how you can prepare yourself beforehand can be easily negated, or some of it can be negated by just doing that prep.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, you have to get the reps in with your deck. You have to get the reps in with your sideboard. It's not just, I'll pick up the deck, grab the guide, I'm good to go. You can do that maybe for an F&M, sure, you'll do fine. But at anything where anyone is preparing to actually win and win something higher level, the competition is high. It's not an easy thing to do. Everyone else that is going to succeed is going to be practicing quite a bit. And the more practice you put, you're just putting yourself in a more advantageous position. There's nothing you lose by actually preparing and going over your deck 1,000 times. It is not poker. We were talking about this a little earlier. It's not poker. It's not a game where you just learn the theory and, do that. The hands are ever changing. The decks are ever changing. It's completely different. Don't get me wrong, poker is hard in and of itself. I couldn't play it. But Magic is incredibly complex. Do yourself a favor. Put the reps in. Do what you know you're supposed to do. And that will get you much further in this game than anything else.
What reps will do as well, it will give you an understanding of those cards, an understanding of matchups. If you understand why you're bringing this card, or you understand why the sideboard is the way it is, or why people have been sideboarding the way they are, and if you understand the patterns of your opponent's deck and also your deck, you'll gain that like I said, understanding of what to do, and you only really get that from reps. Like I could tell you this is how you play this deck, this is how you do that. But then, like for example, we had a new player recently, and we said, "Oh, we've got these decks we can try." They wanted to try Domain and Standard. I was like, probably not the best deck to start. Here's the game plan, but there's a lot of nuances within that game in order to achieve that, and doing certain things at certain turns, when to hold up certain cards, and why you're doing that is what you get, or the value of getting reps in.
Exactly. And the other thing about getting reps in as well is that if you only play a small number of games, if you only do a small amount, your sample size of when things are good or bad is much smaller. And that can lead you into getting into statistical errors where you start saying, well, in this 2-3 games that I've played, this sideboard card was really good. And that might be an anomaly, it might be an aberration. If you're not getting a statistically large enough sample size of the amount of interactions that you're having within game with your sideboard cards, by having the large number of reps, you're not going to know for sure whether or not this is the correct strategy or not.
If you quantify the reps that you play, a lot of people have an Excel document. If you quantify the reps that you play, and you say you managed to do 100 games with your deck, and you look at the different decks that you faced, then you can see oh, I've got a really bad matchup here. Say my win rate here is only about 42%, 43% against this deck. Do I need to change my sideboard? But then again, if you go against a deck you've got a 20% chance against, for example, I play Toxic in Standard. If I'm against Convoke, my win rate is 10%, 20%. Am I going to bother wasting a sideboard slot against that deck? Or am I just going to be like, you know what, my plan against Convoke is to avoid it. Yeah. That's my plan. And if I come against it, I take the L.
It's one of those discussions.
Okay. I was going to say, so also just one last point on that is that if you have all of this data on when you're winning, you also know when you're winning on the play, when you're winning on the draw. Are you winning game 2? Are you winning game 3? Because you may be winning 60% of game 2s, but 40% of game 3s. Because you're maybe on the play more often, maybe your sideboard cards are different play draw, maybe your opponents are find it easier to sideboard against you because where you're transforming your deck is very easy for them to be able to metagame against.
Exactly. Yeah. It's something that I've seen in many different formats. For example, you have Yawgmoth in Modern versus Amulet Titan. That matchup, game 1, is horrendous for Yawgmoth. It's not very good. It's rough. It's hard. But game 2 and 3, it is abysmal for Titan. Titan can't win. It feels like it's 80-20 after the fact. Why? Because of sideboarding. There's a lot of nuance in these kind of things that you learn from playing the game. Whereas if you were just, for the first time picking up these decks and you just grabbed the generic sideboard list and went into it, I'm more than sure that most people would not know how to sideboard properly to actually defeat the matchup and how to utilize those sideboard pieces correctly. It's not an easy thing to do, especially when decks are complex like Yawgmoth or Titan. You have to know why the tool is used, how it's used, and how to make it work most effectively and when in the matchup. And it's one of those things that a lot of people don't realize when they're first getting into competitive Magic. This is what separates the good players from the really good players. They learn why, how, and when for each and every single one of their cards, including the sideboard.
You'll notice as well that the more you do this, the more reps you get in. You will have your piece of paper with your sideboard strategy on it, but you'll notice that you'll use it less and less, because you start to know your game plan, you start to understand why, and you start to know what cards are coming in, what cards are coming out on the play, on the draw, what the game 2, what the game 3 is going to look like, and ultimately you can see what that game 2 and 3 is going to look like, and that's when your sort of work is coming into fruition, because you are picking up that guide less, you're looking at that guide less, and you might just look at it and be like, just a double check, have that sort of safety warm and fuzzies to make sure you are actually doing it. And then the more you do that, comes with reps, you'll just stop looking.
And also, don't forget, when you're in a game, while you can't take notes before the game starts, after you've started playing and things are happening, you see cards that you didn't expect from your opponent, whether it's game 1 or 2 or whatever's happening in that regard, you're actually allowed to take notes on it. You can write down, I've seen this card. Maybe you've seen 2 of the card, maybe you saw some in the graveyard, who knows? And you can take notes on what you've seen and use that information that you've collected to then make your sideboard decision. Let's say you're playing against blue-white control in Standard, and you saw that they brought in more of that. What's his name? The 5/5 flyer that sacrifice a clue, gives it one of whatever keyword abilities, and you saw them bring in more of those. Okay, so now they have maybe 2, maybe 3, who knows, of that card. And now you can properly prepare to beat it, because it is a hard card to beat if you don't have anything against it. Most people are removing the removal for it, but if you know it's there and you've seen it, you can make those notes for your sideboard plan and bring in more cards to defeat it. Those little kinds of advantages.
Cards like that, cards that can gain hexproof, and suddenly a very simple thing like, well, I know they've got creatures in the deck, but I specifically need to know that I need to get rid of like an edict effect so that I can get around their hexproof effect. Or maybe if it's a control mirror match, maybe it's you just leave in some sweepers.
Exactly. Because a lot of people will take out their Sunfalls, their Wraths, or whatever else in the mirror match, and then get caught with their pants down when they can't destroy this creature that is super annoying. And it's one of those kind of things you need to remember in game to do. So it takes a bit of practice. It'll take a lot of experience of getting beat by those kind of things, and to really start taking proper, good, realistic notes of what's going on in game.
And also, it's not just about what you do see, it's also about what you don't see. So you can make notes on these things as well. So this is a bit of an anecdote just on this specific part of sideboarding. So back in the standard format, those Battle for Zendikar standard, when Dark Jeskai was like the best deck in the format, and you had the flip Jace, you had Ojutai's Command, you had all of these ways of recurring with a bunch of small creatures like Soulfire Grandmaster as well. So in these mirror matches, these kind of the Haymaker cards, but there are also these value cards that you had as part of your engine. So if you know that your opponent was going to have these 2 and 3 2-cost creatures in their deck, they all died to Fiery Impulse. One of the best Magic players I know is like called Ross Silcock, and he was playing this deck throughout the big Madhouse tournament that we had at the time. Playing in the mirror match, what he was doing as part of his sideboard plan was taking out all of the 2-cost creatures, and therefore stranding a bunch of Fiery Impulses in his opponent's hands. But unless you can take the notes to know, well, hang on a minute, none of my 2-cost creatures died during this particular game. Has my opponent boarded out these things? If all you're looking out for is just, well, what has my opponent brought in? What other cards am I looking for that they might have changed to? What also might they have taken out that I've not seen throughout this entire game? Because that's something that you otherwise might not notice unless you're taking notes.
Exactly.
Magic is a game where there's so many decisions. Like it's probably I think someone worked out it's like the most complex game in existence. And there's so many decisions, there's so many micro decisions that the more information you can leverage, more information you can have, can better enhance the decisions you make. And it's all about reasons. Why am I making this decision? Because there's times in Magic where it could be like a crossroads. Like I could do this might happen. I could do this might happen. But what information have I gathered before I've actually made that decision that will help me make that decision? And that even comes to sideboarding. When you're sideboarding, right, I'm going to look at my notes. I've seen this card. And even if Helena said, like, I have not seen this card, if you think it's worthy of making a note over, write it down. And when you sideboard, because you might forget about it in that moment of pressure when you've got a certain time to make your sideboard adjustments and such, or you are 1-1, you're in your winning ins for top 8 or whatever. There's a lot of pressure on you, and if you can make those notes as you think of them and then come back to them, that will just help you make that decision better. So we've covered quite a lot there on sideboarding. It was a real good deep dive, a real good conversation, and I think it's one of those, sideboard's one of the skills that you'll never master, and even the pros you could never really master, because one change in the meta can completely change how you sideboard. I mean, recently we had one card banned out on Modern, and it's completely shifted the meta. If Cascade isn't a problem anymore, then why have I got, as Louis said before, why have I got 3 or 4 Chalice of Voids in my sideboard? And it's one of those things that you have to constantly adjust, change, look at. Theory craft, it's one of the biggest probably things you theory craft within the game of Magic, and constantly hone those skills to the point where you can effectively and confidently being the key word, come and approach your sideboard.
Absolutely. Thank you everybody for listening in on us with us today. It is, we're not masters by any means, but I think we have a good level of knowledge of it all. Helena more than most. And we do appreciate you coming and joining us for another episode of Battle Chats. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and share with all your friends. I'm sure your grandmother would love to listen to this podcast. Give it a whirl, guys. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for being here as well, Helena.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute blast.
Cheers, Helena. Cheers,
Take
Louis.
care, guys.
Take care.
Bye.